Hi, my name is Davis Stellar. This is Bordeaux 101 at Cellar School with Zachys. Uh, kind of moving forward off of the foundation that we started with a couple of weeks ago, we're going to use all of that viticulture knowledge, all of that production knowledge, and start to hone in on different regions throughout the world, starting with Bordeaux here, a region that I think is a really good gateway to kind of start building off of the foundation that we have. I'm going to skip the About Me section. Just a bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. Just a little bit of a snapshot of where we are historically, geographically, climate, and some of the grapes that go into these wines that we're going to be tasting and talking about today. And then kind of differentiating the sub-regions within Bordeaux, talking about the left bank, the right bank, some of the smaller appellations therein, and then a couple other mentionable places like Sauternes, Barsac, and Entre-deux-Mers, and we'll get there in a moment. But to start off with everything, a little bit of an understanding of where we are. We are in the southwest of France, not really south-south, but a little more than south. Think about like if you were to break France up into thirds, we're at like the lower third on the very southwest side of that lower third. Second third, that little line right there. This area has been making wine for a long period of time, but it really is well known as like the birthplace of modern fine wine, and that's primarily because of the English and the Dutch. Surprisingly, back in the 17th century, the Dutch were raiding this area right here, which is an area that we call the Médoc now. We'll talk about that in a minute, but this area is historically salt marshes primarily, and a lot of gravel. And the Dutch loved to go in there. They loved to raid all of that gravel and salt and bring it up towards their homeland. And similarly, also the English started dipping their toes into it once the Dutch found this thing they called claret. In England, oftentimes we hear them use that word claret. It is their way of calling red Bordeaux. Back in the day, that was the word they used, and to this day, they still use it when talking about red Bordeaux, even though the global market just calls it Bordeaux. And in this way, at that time, it was primarily red wine. Over the years, it has transitioned to be reds, white, sparkling, and some rosé, although that's like only like 2% of the market, as is the sparkling wine, primarily dominated, of course, by reds, maybe 20% white, some sweet wine, maybe 5% sweet wine, and all of that too. A cool little fun fact that I love about Bordeaux is that within the country of France, we have these amazingly well-known regions. We have Burgundy, we have the Loire, we have Champagne. Interestingly enough, this is the largest production of French wine in the country. There are 50 appellations that you can see strewn about there. They all have their own unique identities naturally, but it is a massive amount of vineyard land. It's about 120,000 hectares, which is, if I'm trying to put that into sizing, something probably along the lines of maybe 300 to 400 acres planted, 300 to 400,000 acres planted, which is a sizable amount of acreage. The focus here really isn't ever, or has never been, base wine. There certainly are cuvées that are around that table wine status, but the idea really here is the highest end as possible, not just because the land cost is quite high, but because the quality of wine coming out of this region very naturally is something that is appreciated more on the high-end market. We're going to talk about classifications and all of that in a minute, probably towards the end of this presentation, once we have a bit of a framework to kind of understand where we are, what we're talking about, rather than diving right into that. But just to kind of move along in terms of what we're going to be talking about most specifically, we're going to be talking about kind of 3 to 4 primary areas. We're talking about the left bank Bordeaux, which they call the Médoc. We're going to be talking about the right bank of Bordeaux, which is over here. It also sometimes is called the Libournais, but we won't really be calling it that, especially because in America and in the English-speaking wine market, it's just referred to as the right bank. Some other interesting areas that are probably focused more on a 201 class would be the Bléon de Bourg, the Entre-deux-Mers, and we'll go into some of the areas of Graves and Pessac-Léognan, but for now, we're really just going to be focusing on the Médoc and the right bank and a little bit of this little area right here. It's the regions of Sauternes and Barsac. But again, just as a little snapshot of what we're really talking about volumetrically, down in the bottom right corner, again, 300 acres, 300,000 acres, 120,000 hectares planted. You can see some of the regional breakdowns here, which I think is a good help to see kind of how diversified these smaller regions especially can be. Over on the right bank, you see that with that pink, purple, yellow, and kind of inching into that green area there. But to get kind of more situated climactically, on the left bank, we're really talking about something that is a very maritime controlled climate. Thinking a lot similarly, interestingly enough, about the Northeast in the US. Thinking about like the Atlantic effect, estuaries, really like the Long Island Sound, I think is a really good 1-to-1 ratio, not just because of the climate itself, but also the breakdown geographically. If we think about Long Island looking like this with that little fork at the end, we also kind of have that in a different orientation over here, but in a similar way. Long Island Sound used to be marshland and all of this hundreds of thousands of years ago, as is this. We're talking about a river region that has an estuary in it. It's called the Gironde estuary, and it's kind of planted out by these two rivers here. We have the Dordogne and the Gironde right here. These are the two rivers that go into that estuary, really cultivating that maritime effect. It's highly seasonal in that way. It is mild winters, nothing really getting above that 40 degree or below that 40 degree Fahrenheit range. And the summers are hot and humid, but they rarely get to a place of what they call scorching, which is anywhere really above that 95 degree range. But in that way, because it is maritime, there's a lot of humidity. There's a lot of rain that goes on here, which is good in some ways, and we'll talk about why that's good in a minute. But we're also going to understand why that could face a problem. As we heard about in the viticulture class, a lot of rain can produce mildew problems. It can produce root rot. It creates these really heavy pressures in the vineyard site. But that's where soil comes into play, and why the particularly gravel soils that we see in Bordeaux come to be a great advantage to combat some of those heavy rainfalls. It also provides a lot of depth, and we'll talk about why that is when maybe we're tasting some of these wines. On the left bank, as I showed you, that Médoc region, on the kind of left side of that fork we're talking about in the Gironde, it's colder, it's windier, you're on a peninsula, so you're a little more isolated and kind of open to the ocean effects. In this way, though, there, as I mentioned before, are these gravel soils, and the primary grape variety we're talking about there is Cabernet Sauvignon for the most part. That's a grape variety that is really tactfully planted there. The idea there is that it's a late ripener, as we spoke about with our viticulture class. There are some grapes that ripen earlier. There are some grapes that push earlier in bud break. And the late ripener identity with Cabernet Sauvignon is really well placed there, just because that prolonged growing season moderated by that maritime climate benefits Cabernet Sauvignon quite advantageously. On the other side of the Gironde, we have the right bank of Bordeaux. It's warmer climate. It's continental more than it is maritime, because it's a little more inland, a little more protected, and the soil types are not as grounded in pure gravel, but there's clay and there's limestone, which produces this depth and this richness, which you certainly can see complemented in the winemaking in the right bank, but you primarily will certainly see that in the grapes produced in that area. It's Merlot and Cabernet Franc primarily. Something worth noting, though, is the more recent extremes of climate change in the area, which has affected frost quite early in the season. In 2017 and 2021, two vintages that were thought to be really challenging, they were met with a frost early in the year. With grape varieties like Cabernet Sauvignon, while it might be a late ripener, it's an earlier pusher. That's to say that in bud break in the season, it pushes earlier, which means if there's a frost event earlier in the year and it aligns with the same time as Cabernet Sauvignon, that Cabernet Sauvignon will not be as protected as something like Cabernet Franc, which is a late pusher. It's one of the grape varieties that starts pushing out of the cane maybe towards the very, very end of that bud break season, thinking about mid-May even. And for that reason, in vintages like 21 and 17, Cabernet Franc and Merlot were a little more protected than Cabernet Sauvignon, which was pretty heavily damaged in 17 and 21. But let's talk about where all of these grapes come from before we move on any farther. In Bordeaux, historically, Cabernet Franc is the king. This is the grape variety that kind of spread itself throughout the region and gave birth to a lot of grape varieties that we know today. We're talking about Cabernet Sauvignon. It's a child of Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and Sauvignon Blanc. We're talking about Malbec, which is a grandchild of Cabernet Franc and another ancient grape variety that is kind of funny here, which is a strain of Cabernet Franc that is grown in an area called the Charente. It's the area that is kind of closer up towards Cognac, but there's a very specific strain of Cabernet Franc that kind of created its own identity down the line. Slightly different genetics, but still identifies within the family of Cab Franc, which also crossed with its own self to make Merlot. I think that's really funny because you're starting to get like the child, grandchild thing here. It's very, for lack of better words, incestual in Bordelais grape varieties, that is. You have Carmenere, it's a child of Cabernet Franc and Cabernet Sauvignon, another incestual baby, if you will. And then you have things like Petit Verdot. It is a grape variety that was brought to the region by the Romans by way of Burgundy as they were traveling up through Italy and across France, and planted in Bordeaux, and now is considered hundreds of years later, thousands of years later, a Bordelais grape variety. All of these grape varieties you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, and these are what are, they not only look very, very, very similar, but they are all in the same family as we know it today. Two of these grape varieties, although are not grown in Bordeaux very abundantly anymore, that is Malbec and Carmenere. Carmenere you primarily see growing in Chile, and Malbec you see growing primarily in Argentina. This is simply by way of colonization and bringing grapes elsewhere, while the market demanded a higher planting for things like Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Merlot, and Petit Verdot. These are also a lot of the grape varieties we saw brought to Napa later in the 1900s. It's worth noting kind of some of the more identifiable factors here for some of these grapes. You have something like Cabernet Franc. It's well known for its fragrance. It's very black and red fruited. It's very fresh, but it's also very peppery. It's what they call a highly pyrazinic grape variety. That is thinking about bell peppers, thinking about graphite. And we also see that kind of reflected in its first child, that is Cabernet Sauvignon. It's this powerful, austere grape variety. It's deep in color. It's highly, highly tannic, and it's black and red fruited as well, which it gets from the Cabernet Franc. Malbec, on the other hand, it's this rich, inky, thick-skinned grape. It's highly tannic, blue fruits, blackberry, and primarily identifiable by some of its spice characteristics. That's like black pepper and tobacco. Then we're thinking about something really plush like Merlot. It's this textural, highly alcoholic, blue, red fruit wine. It's just plush and quite kind of elegant in its identity. Last but not least is the child from Burgundy. It's very different than all of these grape varieties, and that's only natural considering it comes from somewhere else. It's a grape variety that is really like, I think the word that I've heard most frequently associated with Petit Verdot is meaty, M-E-A-T-Y. It's floral, it's deep in color, it's highly tannic, but it's a grape variety that oftentimes is used as a blender rather than a single variety wine because of how powerful and kind of overwhelmingly meaty. If anything, the only time I've ever seen it as like a single variety, it has just been something that needs to be produced quite young to counteract some of that more overwhelming quality. Moving on to some of our friends on the white camp, while Cabernet Franc might be the king, Sauvignon Blanc is the queen. She is the one that kind of brought all of these grape varieties into birth and into this world in Bordeaux. We're thinking about Semillon. It's Sauvignon Blanc and Gouais Blanc. Gouais Blanc is a grape variety that is also the parent to some grape varieties that we know and love, like Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. It is an ancient grape variety, seldom seen on its own these days, but back in the day used to be pretty widely planted, maybe about 300 years ago, primarily in eastern France. And then you have something like Sauvignon Gris, which is just a mutation of Sauvignon Blanc. Outside of that, similar to Petit Verdot, there are two grape varieties that are widely grown in Bordeaux now that were not typically grown and originated in Bordeaux. That is Colombard, French Colombard, and Muscadel. French Colombard we see grown, while historically in Bordeaux, primarily now in the area around Armagnac and Cognac, and that's because those are the grape varieties that go into making those spirits. Now, Muscadel is kind of taken the crown for the kind of invader into Bordeaux. Both of these made way to Bordeaux by the Romans and the Gales by way of the Loire originally, which I think is quite interesting that Colombard stopped halfway down and only trickled into Bordeaux. Unfortunately, now Colombard is not very widely planted, even though it is my favorite single variety white wine. You have Sauvignon Blanc, which is this kind of grassy, very bell peppery grape variety, highly acidic, bright and shining. Sometimes that is met with some oak production. We'll talk about that maybe in a little while. Semillon, it's this textural, weighty grape variety that gives way to a lot of the sweet wines that we see coming out of Bordeaux. And then you have Muscadel, it's floral, it's intense, it's fruity. And last but not least, Colombard is this like electric white wine. It is really, really citrusy, vibrant, bright, and jumpy. If I could ever get my hands on some, I would love to share it with you all. A little snapshot off the beaten path for a minute. We're going to talk about a grape variety that I think is just like fascinating, which is Mombadon, as it's well known. It's known today as Burger. It's a cross between a grape variety called Ugni Blanc, which is planted pretty widely in the south of France on the Côte d'Azur, but it is in the area of Provence. But it is actually originally an Italian grape variety. It's Trebbiano Toscano. It's the other name for Ugni Blanc. And then it's Folle Blanche, which is a grape variety that we also know as Picpoul. Pardon me. Picpoul, typically grown in the south of France and then up in the northwestern part of France. It's like this wine that is very salty and pithy. It kind of goes very well typically with things like oysters. It's a native to the Gironde, which is what we're talking about. It's that estuary land that surrounds Bordeaux, but it's been lost primarily. There are very, very, very few plantings left. If I'm not mistaken, I think only 1 acre of those 300,000 acres planted in Bordeaux has Mombadon to this day. But the primary place you see it, of all things, is in California now. It is used as what they call jug wine. It's like you go to your box store and you pick up a jug of like Carlo Rossi, and primarily if it's a white Carlo Rossi, it's going to be Mombadon. There's like one vineyard in Sonoma that still has Mombadon, but the vines are quite old and they're struggling. I have a good friend of mine, we know the producer Flowers. Flowers was founded by a gentleman named Greg LaFollette, and he is now doing his own thing outside of Flowers, but he's one of these real champions of surprisingly Bordelais grape varieties in America. and his passion is French Colombard, but also he is an avid hunter of weird Bordelais grape varieties in the world. And he is the one who found that last vineyard in Sonoma with the grape, the Mambadon planted, which I think is kind of interesting. So we're going to do a little tasting right now as a foreshadow to what we're about to talk about. We have two wines here today, one coming from the right bank, the other coming from the left bank. On the right side of the Gironde, we have primarily a grape variety of, primarily a mix of Cabernet Franc and Merlot. It's coming from Saint-Emilion. It's Grand Cru Classé. I'll talk about what that means in a minute. The producer is Chateau Grandmont. It is 2022 vintage, but a wine here to pay attention primarily to texture. It is a wine that I would love your feedback on, especially in conjunction against the second wine I'm going to pour for you momentarily. The second wine I'm pouring right now is a wine called Chateau Cantemer. It's out of a region called the Médoc. We're going to talk about where that is right in a minute, but I want to hear, oh, sorry, Robert. I want to hear your thoughts about the difference between these two wines. Any feelings, differences people note? So the glass on your right-hand side, we're talking about the wine from Saint-Emilion, the one on the right bank. The one on your left-hand side will be the one on the left bank. So what do you taste, what do you feel on your palate between the first wine and the second wine? The wine on your left, what are we thinking texturally?
Less fruit.
Less fruit, okay. What do you think about kind of how it feels on your mouth, tannin quality?
A little drier.
Little drier, okay. And the right bank?
Not as much, but a little more fruit.
Yeah, more fruity.
A little bigger.
Yeah.
In style.
On the nose, what do you notice as the difference between these two wines?
It's a little bit more on the nose on the left bank, in my opinion. The right bank's a little bit more subdued, a little bit more tertiary.
So not as fruit driven, you're saying? Maybe a little more of those kind of oak integrated qualities. I think, yeah, that's very true.
Bank a little bit more, much more aromatic, a little bit more cedar on the nose.
As opposed to the right bank, which is a little more like vanilla and spice driven, maybe?
I find it a little bit more muted, a little bit more polished though on the palate.
Got it. Got it. I think all of these are
More doing on the left bank.
more,
complex.
pardon? More complexity on the left bank?
Yeah.
Yeah. What do we think on the palate? Fruit profile, textural, nothing else?
And then on the palate, to me, the left bank is a little bit more, Robert was saying, a little bit more explosive. I got more fruits on the left bank than on the right bank.
What do we think about minerality here? Thinking about some of those basic identities that I mentioned before, where on the left bank it's gravelly soil, and on the right bank it's primarily clay and limestone.
Like left bank is a little more like salinity.
I definitely agree there. For me, I think the identifiable factors really boil down to the gravel versus the clay soils here. Talking about kind of a concentration in flavor, in power, in plushness on the right bank, the wine from Saint-Emilion, whereas on the left bank, I think I'm noticing, to your point, Robert, a little bit of that kind of cedar identity, but it's that gravel thing that kind of carries the texture for me. It makes it a little more almost gritty against the plushness on the right bank. Let's talk about why that might be. So here we have the basic breakdown, a little overview of where we are geographically. On the left bank, we have an area here, all up and down, that's called the Médoc and the Haut-Médoc. Confusingly, the Haut-Médoc means upper Médoc, but it's below the Médoc, which is kind of weird. On the right bank, we're really going to be focusing on this area right here. It's an area called Pomerol and an area called Saint-Emilion. Then we have this area in green here. It's an area called Entre deux mers. It means between two seas, and that's necessarily because it's between the two rivers that flow into the Gironde. We have the Dordogne River here and the Gironde River here. The city of Bordeaux on the western side of the Gironde. Last but not least, we're going to be focusing a little bit here in this area of Pessac-Léognan and Grave, and last down here in Sauternes and Barsac. The basic appellations here, you have Bordeaux AOP, you have grapes coming from all over. It can be red wine, white wine, sweet wine, or rosé. And last but not least, you have some bubbles coming from this area. It's called, Cremant de Bordeaux. Throughout France, if you ever see Cremant, it is their style of a sparkling wine. It can also be a rosé sparkling wine, but Cremant on its own is sparkling, and then it'll be de, the region. So you have Cremant de Bourgogne, you have Cremant de Bordeaux, you have Cremant de Loire. All over France, that's going to be the case. And every region has that identity. Every region will have that Cremant for that particular region. Let's focus on the left bank for a second. We're talking about primarily red wines. We're talking about Cabernet Sauvignon, that is Cabernet Franc, Merlot, and Petit Verdot, oftentimes in a blend, typically heavily dominant towards the Cabernet Sauvignon. More often than not, about like 75% of that cuvée will be Cabernet Sauvignon or more, then balanced out with things like Cabernet Franc and Merlot and Petit Verdot, trying to pull all of those little finessed qualities that you can find in those latter grape varieties. Where on the white side of things, Sauvignon Blanc is going to be the driving factor here, balanced out by that kind of honeyed characteristic of the Semillon, that floral characteristic of the Muscadel. But we're going to talk about four main appellations here. We're going to talk about these regions kind of from north to south, Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, Saint-Julien, and then all the way down here, Margaux. Listrac and Mouly we'll talk about in 201 because those are wines that we don't really see too frequently in kind of the colloquial market, more of a niche identity there. But the former four, that is Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, and Saint-Julien, Margaux, these are the ones that have quite a bit of fame. I'll talk about why that might be. As I mentioned earlier, this is the area that the Dutch found in like the 17th century by way of kind of their maritime exploration, and they really exploited this place not just because it was a very dense forest and it had quite good provisions for wood, but it also was a salt marsh, and salt was heavily sought after at this time historically, and it also had quite a bit of gravel, and as we know, the Dutch were really big builders, and this is where they sourced their gravel back in the 1700s. We have the Upper Médoc. It's really well-drained soils right down here. Strangely enough, this is where you get the most, the largest concentration of these big gravelly rocks. They're very porous, kind of confusingly, considering that this used to be forest and marshland, but the forest and marshland was really up here more than it was down here. This is where things started to become a little more planal. And with that, the gravel soils started to become a little more well-drained. It wasn't as heavily planted in the past, and that means there's less compression on the soil itself. Wines from the Médoc and the Haut-Médoc are typically seen as what we know today as table wine. Don't let that distract you from how high-end these wines are. They do still catch, to your point in your question before, Samantha, they do catch a pretty penny. And they're sourced from all over, vineyards that don't really fall within the superior village or regional regulations. They're pretty Merlot dominated for the most part, which is kind of crazy to me. But in this case, that's kind of the exception. Wines here are typically aged in oak barrique of a very particular size. They're 225 liters outside of the expectation of 228 liters, which we see widely spread across France otherwise, primarily out of Burgundy. Talking a little bit about the structure of some of these wines, we're talking about the Médoc. That is very, very well structured. It has this really firm backbone. It's earthy, it's cassis, it's cedar, it's highly, highly tannic. The Haut Médoc is a little more classic on that graphite identity that I mentioned before, really carrying in that identity coming from those pyrazines I mentioned in the Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc. And it's balanced a little out by that oak identity. But really focusing on the identities here, Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, Saint-Julien, and Margaux. And in Saint-Estèphe, we have these really muscular wines. They're rustic, they're dense, they're very peppery, and they're age-worthy wines. These are wines that have a tannin and acid quality that can prolong the use of time. That is, as wines age, that tannin quality softens out the sediment within the tannin starts to precipitate out of the wine itself, and it's balanced out against an acid that doesn't really change as a wine is in bottle. In Pauillac, you have these really powerful and regal wines. They're pencil lead outside of graphite, pencil lead driven, and cigar box driven, which I think was where Robert was going with some of his comments about the Cantomar that we just tasted. Again, in Saint-Julien, we have these more polished and harmonious, balanced wines. They're silky, they're poised, they're dark fruited, they're very elegant in that way. And last but not least, in the far south, we have Margaux. This is a perfumed, floral, refined, and very finessed wine. They're very sensual in their texture. That tannin quality is very velvety, as you often hear it. Next, moving down to the south of the Médoc, we're in Grave and the area of Pessac-les-Oignons. It's more clay and sand soils than it is found in the Médoc. And these are lighter, less tannic, more finessed wines. As we followed in that span from north to south in the Médoc, we had Saint-Estèphe was very muscular and powerful and age-worthy. In Margaux, we had that finessed character, and now in Grave and in Pessac, we have these incredibly finessed wines that are less tannic by way of it being a little more protected. That sugar in the grapes can ripen a little more comfortably. Reds and dry whites are what you're going to find here, primarily in Pessac. Reds and whites. Grave will be reds and whites as well. The whites are creamier. They're herbal. They're backed by more texture due to use of more oak historically here, whereas the reds aren't necessarily considered the top-tier Bordeaux wines. That's not to say there aren't exceptions, because there's one very notable exception from Pessac, that is Haut-Brion. I'll talk a little bit more about Haut-Brion, the first growths, in a minute, but that is kind of the flagship for fine wine out of this region. In Grave, we have wines that are smoky, mineral, balanced. They're quite savory, whereas Pessac, you have more refined, toasty qualities, elegant fruit. Its finesse is really the backbone. Whites here are more flinty and kind of leaning more into that pyrazinic quality you can find from Sauvignon Blanc. The sweet wines technically are within the realm of Grave, but I have them separated off later on because they are their own beast in and of themselves. But they're at the very south of the region here. We're primarily going to focus on Barsac and Sauterre. So moving across the Dordogne and into the right bank, we're on the eastern side of the Dordogne and the Gironde. And we're really focusing at this time on these two appellations here, Pomerol and Saint-Emilion. There are some wider appellations like Fronsac and Le Land de Pomerol. We're not going to be talking about those in a class like this today, but the idea really here is to just get a snapshot of what the right bank of Bordeaux means. As I mentioned before, on the left bank we had Sauvignon, Cabernet Sauvignon driven wines. On the right bank, we have Merlot and Cabernet Franc driven wines. These wines are typically a lot more plush and plump, as it were. The primary appellations, as I said, were Pomerol and Saint-Emilion. Pomerol is like top-tier French Merlot. In Pomerol, you're going to find typically blends of primarily and only Merlot. These are producers such as Petrus or Lafleur. Think about, in this way, Bordeaux's most plump and extravagant wines. It's chocolate, it's plums. These wines are balanced. They have a really hard edge on the fine side of things with producers like Petrus and Lafleur. These are wines that have rigidity built into them against that plumpness of the Merlot by way of the winemaker's hand. There are a lot of tactics that we can use that we talked about in the last class, such as different mediums of extraction and pump overs versus punch downs. This is kind of like where hardcore winemaking finds its way into French Bordeaux wines. Merlot is a grape, naturally, that is really bold and brash and plump, and it's very hard to make with a backbone, which is what kind of brought notoriety to Pomerol, because it was winemakers in this region that started to integrate that backbone very difficultly to a grape variety that doesn't necessarily have that. Alternatively here, moving to Saint-Emilion, we're going to be talking about wines that are Merlot and Cabernet, so Cabernet Franc driven. The limestone and clay soils drive everything here, and that's the wine you tasted today with the Chateau Grand Man. This is a wine to me that I think speaks really well to the region here. You have a good balance of Merlot and Cabernet Franc. That is that plump freshness that you find with the Merlot, but that backbone that you see in Pomerol integrated by winemakers is actually carried by the Cabernet Franc itself in Saint-Emilion. We're talking about half of the blend kind of being Cabernet Franc for the most part in Saint-Emilion. It adds a fair amount of that firmness against the Merlot. Modern days of Saint-Emilion, it's more ripe. It's less fatty and it's more rigid than Pomerol. It's typically known as just being geographically, as we can see, it's quite a bit larger geographically. More plantings, more larger expression of place. Also a little farther south, which means it's more insulated, more protected, and with that, it's riper. It's velvety against the more seductive, kind of fleshy, lush, silky, dense expressions of Pomerol that we know. So moving just south of the right bank and going into the region called Entre-deux-Mers, we're between the two rivers of the Garonne and the Dordogne, and these wines are primarily Merlot based. You see a fair amount of white wine grown here. You also have like the larger AOP here of Côte de Bordeaux. It's the general appellation. As I mentioned before, we're not in the Médoc now, and things are kind of becoming more plainal. And in that way, there are less slope sites, which, yeah.
What is AOP?
AOP is the appellation. AOP is Appellation Origine Protégée. It's the kind of more general acronym for any appellation within France. Then you have AOC, which is going to be more of the, I'll talk about classifications in a minute. Bordeaux is a very weird exception of the French appellation system, which is why I saved it for the end, just because it helps to have a snapshot of the geography before getting to the classifications, because it's kind of funky. And in that way, the Côte de Bordeaux has less cellaring potential. It's more bang for your buck in that way. They're kind of buy and pop kind of things. Entre-deux-Mers, we're between the two rivers again, plainal and more white wines here. It's laser focused Sauvignon Blanc, more akin to the Sauvignon Blancs that we see from the eastern side of the Loire Valley. We do see some hills, I should add, in this area. That's why they call it the Côte de Bordeaux. Côte means hills. And they're more inland. It's very dramatic, kind of picturesque. But that's more seen on the eastern side of the Garonne and the Gironde, closer towards the area of Grave, more than it is in Entre-deux-Mers. Hopping across the Garonne now, we had Entre-deux-Mers over here, and now across in the Barsac, we have Grave surrounding us here. The very north, we have Pessac-Léognan. Up here, we have the city of Bordeaux. But here, we're talking solely about sweet wine and white wine. We're talking about Semillon based wines, some Cabernet, some Sauvignon Blanc, excuse me, some Muscadel, but we're really talking about Semillon that has been botrycized. Botrycized is also well known to be like noble rot, as we often hear it today. It's this mold that is produced by how humid it gets here. It's called botrytis, that's the name of the mold. It's grown in humid environments and it prematurely raisins the berries on the clusters. It adds this honey and this depth, this dried apricot identity into the wines. It isn't an even grower though, so botrytis grows across clusters in very strange ways. Sometimes it will just be on the inside of the canopy because that's where the humidity is at its most dense. And for that reason, producers are needing to do a lot more work to harvest these grapes. You can't just go through once and pull all the cluster at one time. You have to pull half of the cluster and go grape by grape, which is a large labor cost because of how many passes you have to do naturally. It also will decrease the yield because the berries raisin, there's not going to be as much juice, therefore there's not going to be as much wine, and with that you have more labor involved in producing these wines. They also have like this very rich golden hue. It's typically an indicator of really, really high quality wine, but that's typically seen, strangely enough, not in Barsac, but more typically in Sauternes. Sauternes, it's the most notable of these sweet wines. It's farther south and a little more protected, which produces a little more of that humidity, that insulation. And in this area, new oak is used a lot more predominantly than you see it in Barsac. It's really balancing out that kind of honey and dried apricot with that vanilla and spice from the barrels. In Sauternes, you get these honeyed, botrycized wines, apricot. They're very opulent and saffron-driven wines, whereas in Barsac, you have a smaller choice of producers. Not only is the region geographically smaller than Sauternes, but it's farther north and more exposed, and in that, there's a little more of a salty, lighter identity to these wines. They're more citrus-driven and even sweetness. It's a little more elegant and refined against the concentration of Sauternes. Last but not least, we're going to talk about classifications here. Now that we know where we are and what we're talking about geographically, we're going to talk a little bit about history that started to define these particular geographical regions. In 1855, Napoleon III established the appellation system. It was this strange idea at the time that didn't find the rest of France for almost 100 years. In the early 1900s, around 1930, the establishment of the appellation system writ large found the country, but in Bordeaux, it was there first. And the idea was to establish a hierarchy of vineyard sites, particularly. And it started with essentially a triangle of, at the very top, first growth, then second growth, third growth, fourth growth, fifth growth, and then underneath that, basic AOP. Basic village level wines. It's not what we know to today, that is thinking about Grand Cru versus Premier Cru versus village wines. This is really based off of vineyard site and chateau within a village or within an appellation, and kind of narrowing it down by producer, not necessarily by vineyard site, because the producer has a myriad of vineyard sites across the village, and it was vineyard producer driven. And in that way, in 1855, there was an establishment of 5 first growth wines. Not all of them were red, surprisingly. As we know it today, we know 5 first growth red wines, but there were 5 first growths, period, and it was only 4 red wines. It was Lafite, Margaux, Haut-Brion, and Latour. We know the 5th being Mouton, that was only promoted from a secondary or a second growth wine to a first growth wine in 1973. That 5th original first growth was Chateau de Chem. It was an honorary member in the class, as it were, that kind of got a tip of the hat because of how finessed and how well known or how highly appreciated these wines were writ large. Every decade about in these areas, they have a conference that talks about the marketability, the appreciation of these wines, and they then go to a vote to say whether or not this wine should be promoted. And for that reason, that's how you have the accessibility into different hierarchies of the growth category, which is foundational to Napoleon's identity. Napoleon was somebody who wanted to make a meritocracy, essentially, in France. And in that way, the mobility was based off of how well your wines did. And so that decade, once a decade conference allows for mobility, and it also allows for time to show off your stuff, because it can't just be vintage to vintage. It has to capture a certain amount of time. The fact that it took 120 years, 118 years for a new first growth to be promoted should be an indication of how difficult that meritocracy is, though. It's very strict, and for good reason. A second growth wine will fetch a price of maybe $300, whereas a first growth will fetch a price for about $800, if you're thinking about it just marketability-wise. In Pomerol, it's a strange place, though. On the right bank, they don't necessarily operate in the same way as they do on the left bank. That is, they don't have a classification system. If you are within the AOC, or within the geographical boundary of Pomerol, you have the opportunity to enter into the AOC of Pomerol, but that's only if you follow their very, 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 very strict guidelines, which is why Pomerol, if you see it on a bottle, fetches a high price, because the regulations in and of themselves demand that a producer work a lot harder to produce their wines. Otherwise, you can be a Vin de France in Pomerol. That is to say, no, I don't want to follow your regulations, I'm going to do my own thing. Recently, one of the most well-known producers in the Pomerol AOC, that is Chateau Lafleur, decided to leave the AOC because of their lacking volition to follow the regulations. That is to say, French law is very, very rigid, and it's slow to change against the changing effects of our climate. And a producer that has amassed such notoriety like Lafleur, they said, okay, we have enough of a brand, our wines are well known enough, but this government regulation is moving too slowly to combat the climate pressures that we need to react to keep our wines at the quality that we believe they are. In Saint-Emilion, next to Pomerol, just to the south, they have a Grand Cru Classé system and a Premier Grand Cru Classé. The Chateau Grand Mal that we had earlier, that was what they consider a Grand Cru Classé. Every 10 years in Saint-Emilion, they also do a symposium to promote or declassify wines. In Grave, it's just Grand Cru Classé, and that is based off of, again, another, I think, every 5 years symposium. And last but not least, something worth mentioning is the identity of second wines or second labels, which we see all over Bordeaux. The idea here is that over time, these wines have, or these chateaux, have amassed more land and have had to do replantings. And in that way, if you have to replant vines, those vines are not going to meet the standards of the first growth or the first label of a chateau. And for that reason, they don't want to throw away their fruit. So they keep the young vines and maybe they'll separate it off into a secondary label. And that second label is going to be something that is a little less of the quality of the first label while still capturing the identity of place in the glass. Thinking about a handful of these producers that we have on our screen, these are wines that have these really complicated names that are typically an homage to a personal figure of the family, somebody that means something to the history of the chateau. And on the right-hand side here, you can see the first growths and the AOCs that they are part of. That is Lafite and Pauillac, Latour and Pauillac, Margaux and Margaux. Haut-Briand, the only exception to a first growth, that is not in the Médoc, that is in Pessac-les-Oignons at the north part of Grave, kind of just west of the city of Bordeaux. And then you have Mouton added in 73, that is in the Médoc period. These wines are all well regarded marketably. They also all have second labels, as I just mentioned. They also, over time, have started to buy property elsewhere in Bordeaux on the right bank, and that property now has a second label apart from the kind of second growth wine, or second wine of that chateau. You have Latour has some remarkable properties over in Pomerol, for example. And that's what I had to share with you all today.